How we all doing today? It's a Monday morning. Good day to make a nice little episode. Today we're going to talk about two things. Pacific Records out of the west coast of Los Angeles, and KATANGA, the great Pacific Records release by the Tone Poet series. And to be clear, Tone Poet is predominantly Blue Note, but there has been a few Pacific record titles thrown in, and that's got to do with the genealogy of the record labels. Blue Note was of course bought by Liberty in '67. By '70 or so, United Artists buys Liberty, and United Artists had also purchased Pacific Records. Out of the West Coast, they were co-founded by Roy Hart and Richard Bach. And Pacific is such a great label, and it's one that's really kind of overlooked by early jazz collectors. And I gotta say, it's kind of a big mistake. Pacific Records is outstanding, and there's a lot of royalty, not just in the West Coast cool scene, but just like contemporary. There's a lot of modern, hard-driving, varied sounds coming out of the West Coast. It's fairly white dominated, as most of the West Coast scene was, which is as much a reflection of the population out there as it is the business leanings of these West Coast labels. The black musicians tended to flock to New York, and some went west, and there were some black folks in the West Coast, of course. Guys like Dexter Gordon and Teddy Edwards were out there in the late 40s, early 50s during the bebop era. There was a great scene on Central Avenue in Los Angeles. But this post-bebop scene that kind of gets labeled the cool, and it's kind of mislabeled the cool. Because sure, there's West Coast cool, and Chet Baker can be that at times. Chico Hamilton often embodies it very well. Dave Brubeck up at Fantasy. That's a lot of the West Coast cool sound. There's nothing really cooler on this planet than Dave Brubeck's Take 5. It's such a cool sound. But Pacific is doing some great things on the West Coast. And there's such a stable of jazz stalwarts. And I just want to run through some titles real quick to give people a little bit of history, so people know why United Artists grabbed Pacific, and also why are so many Blue Note titles coming out and not the Pacific titles. And that's because these white labels were able to distribute better and sell better, and a lot of these Pacific titles aren't that rare compared to old Blue Notes. KATANGA, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is an exception. It's a very rare Pacific record. I'm going to show you some 10 inches that shows you kind of how cutting edge Pacific was in 52, 53, 54. Jerry Mulligan, the great baritone player, leading some very forward-thinking sessions on the West Coast. Again, Jerry Mulligan Quartet. And these Pacific 10 inches aren't that tough to come by compared to some things. I think it was Roy Hart, it might have been Richard, but I think it was Roy Hart, also co-founded the Nocturne label on the West Coast, which is a lot of the same musicians, but an even smaller imprint with a smaller distribution with the dark blue vinyl. If you see Nocturne 10 inches, don't pass those up. Another Jerry Mulligan Quartet. And Mulligan's one of the most important players in jazz in this era. Even the Black Cats had to listen to what Jerry Mulligan was about. Kitty White is on the Pacifica sub-index, which was a little subsidiary, I think, for more vocal-oriented stuff. Lee Konitz and Jerry Mulligan, another great record. Chet Baker, one of the most important guys in Pacific, a guy that sold pretty well. He was handsome, good-looking. To what the black ladies thought of Dexter Gordon, the white gals thought of Chet Baker. And I think I'd rather spend an hour in a train car with Dexter Gordon than I would with Chet Baker. Chet Baker seems a very moody, drug-addled, unpredictable character. The great Clifford Brown makes this recording on the West Coast, and this predates the Emersy stuff with Max Roach. Tough 10-inch to come by right there. But you already hear the velocity of Clifford Brown. This is the great pianist Russ Freeman. This is Bud Shank. a multi-instrumentalist who makes a string of great recordings at Pacific. I'm going to show you now the 1200 series. There's 100 records in the 1200 series. I have most of them. I'm going to show you some highlights just real quick so you get an idea. And a lot of this stuff's going to be some of the 10-inch stuff repackaged into the LP era. But Chet Baker has a lot of records at Pacific in this sequence. Bud Shank probably has 10 records here in the 1200 series. And by the way, that Bud Shank cover, LA on the cover, some Distant Skyscrapers, great cover, love it. One of my favorite covers is Walt Jerry Mulligan in Paris. This is Russ Freeman and Richard Twardzik. I think those are both 2 10-inches. Great stuff. Jack Montrose, the great arranger. Again, I think some of the Clifford Brown stuff's on this one as well. This is one of the best records from this period. Grand Encounter, 2 degrees east, 3 degrees west. And it's got 3 West Coast guys with Bill Perkins, Chico Hamilton, and Jim Hall. And a couple of East Coast guys with John Lewis and Percy Heath. And this record has like 3 different covers as well. Jim Hall, the great guitar player. It's a great record, tough to come by. Again, there's Russ Freeman and Chet Baker. Russ Freeman is a great, really groove-oriented piano player. Bobby Brookmeyer, the great modern trombone player, who is kind of an equal to Mulligan in some ways with his compositional ideas and forward modern thinking. Gil Evans of Miles Davis fame makes this record here with Cannonball Adderley, actually, in probably 1956. That's a great record, 1246. And you really want to focus on the first 50, 60 titles of the 1200 sequence. So looks like some of the later numbers was stuff that they kind of were just adding in. Doesn't have quite the same unified feel as the first 50, 60 titles. There's Freddie Gambrell. That's a great record. I believe he's a partially blind, visually impaired piano player. Great stuff. Really impressed by that. Chico Hamilton makes a lot of records at Pacific, and he's, like he said, he's the West Coast cool in a lot of ways. Then, for some unknown reason, about 56, 7, they switched to a 400 sequence. There's 401, Bill Perkins. There's 402, Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers Ritual. 403, the Master Sounds, which is Wes Montgomery's brothers, and Wes joins them at times. 407, the great Pepper Adams on the baritone. And they only make 12 records in that sequence, the 400 sequence. And again, I'm not really exactly sure what the deal was. I don't think it was a budget label thing. And there's a few titles that are repackaging. The Cy Tooth was a repackaging of an earlier 1200 sequence record. But then they relaunch and rebrand. And they go with PJ1. And they just start over at the number 1. And again, the titles here are just outstanding. What we're listening to is Lenny McBrown, a great Philadelphia-based drummer, if I recall. This is very great, modern, fairly hard-driven, bluesy feel. Brothers, of course, the great Teddy Edwards, who, like I said, was part of that Central Avenue scene, makes 3 really solid records here at Pacific. When they switch to the PJ1 sequence, there is a change in the feel as well as the look. The art department has a different take now on this new launching, and the music's also somewhat different. And you get a bit more soul jazz, a little bit more R&B influence, even though there's still some great modern. It's never really hard bop. White Cats don't really play hard bop. They can play really fast up tempo that might sound hard bop-ish, but hard bop requires a certain amount of emotional investment that it takes a great deal of anguish to play that angry, that strongly, that emotionally charged. And most of these White Cats on the West Coast, their biggest trouble was getting their drugs that night and finding the right piece of something to lay down with. You know, that was their obsession, their struggle. Curtis Amy, fantastic West Coast sax player, who again the Katanga record's going to relate to. He makes like 3 or 4 records here at Pacific that are just outstanding. Paul Bryant, a great organ player who plays the gospel of the blues and just swells and fills your ear with all kinds of feeling and sound. Les McCann, is a real staple of this next era Pacific. He plays that piano with a lot of stride and groove, reminiscent of Count Basie in some ways, and he puts small groups around him that fill out his sound, and it's a great package. Another Curtis Amy with the great drummer Frank Butler. This record absolutely is fantastic. Those Curtis Amy records I play at my gigs quite a lot. Richard Groove Holmes, another organ player who's a staple of Pacific at this point, along with Les McCann, another great Curtis Amy. I absolutely adore this record with Paul Bryant, the organ player. That record's got some steamy blues on it that will really take you off to dreamland. The Jazz Crusaders, that Texas outfit that became a staple of the jazz kind of crossover R&B sound in the 70s. They started here in the 60s doing some great stuff in this series. Carmel Jones, the great trumpet player, has 2 or 3 sessions here that are outstanding. Gerald Wilson, one of the great West Coast arrangers, just a fantastic guy to bring production value and arrangement to a session. There's Richard Twardzik. Well, again, this is more early stuff, but this is the last set. He passes away, sadly, and they reissued some of his rare outtakes on that. This is kind of a one-off here with the great Kenny Dorham and Jackie McLean. Not something you would think of as a Pacific West Coast PJ number 41. It's got more of a Blue Note feel. It's contemptuous. It's got a lot of fire to it. This is Tricky Lofton with Carmel Jones and Gerald Wilson. Another fantastic session. That you see these records, you should just buy them. They don't go for big money. Claire Fisher, another fantastic West Coast piano player. Art Pepper, who's really more of a contemporary guy, does a little bit of work at Pacific as well. More Jazz Crusaders, and of course the great Joe Pass. And that was just kind of skipping through some of these great artists at Pacific Records. And so Tone Poet has license to work with stuff that was bought up by United Artists. And of course, United Artists was eventually swallowed up by even a much bigger label, which I can't recall. Was it Universal maybe they ended up with? But so all that stuff ends up in one umbrella, even though what's happening at Pacific and what's happening at Blue Note is 3,000 miles apart, and they're not interrelated at any time during their existence. In fact, very few of the same musicians even play on those labels. You know, that Kenny Dorham, Jackie McLean record, that's as Blue Note as Pacific really gets. There's kind of a real gulf between the distribution of Pacific in LA, all the West Coast colleges that were buying these records up, and these guys could go play at those colleges and turn in front of 5,000 kids in the auditorium. That wasn't the story for the East Coast Black Cats. You know, they were selling smaller numbers, there wasn't a ton of black colleges to even play at. You know, it's a very different experience for the black musician in the 50s. But it's the rarity of the Blue Note titles. That's why Tone Poet's been so invested in releasing a lot of that Blue Note stuff. Some of the actual releases are really hard to find. And then, as we all know, they're releasing a lot of the unreleased Blue Note titles, which is a gold mine for a guy like me. Most of the Tone Poet stuff I've bought was stuff that was only released in Japan later. I haven't had to really buy any of the official Blue Note releases on Tone Poet because I've already had those records, either as Japanese or as originals or as United Artists prints. So I haven't bought those Tone Poets. I've just bought the ones that I've always wanted to have that title, but I never found it. But with Pacific, I have pretty much everything that they've put out by Tone Poet so far, and it might just be a Chet Baker if I think about it. But this Katanga record has always been elusive. I used to see it from time to time, back before I knew enough to know what it was, but the cover always kind of connected with me. I'm like, oh, I love that cover. I have a lot of African masks in my back jungle room, as I call it. Always enjoyed that cover. But I never purchased it when I saw it, so I didn't really know who these players were. I was a young infant in jazz. But after I started to become more knowledgeable of Pacific, I'm like, oh, I'll grab that. I know I see it quite a lot. And truth be told, is I haven't seen this record to be purchased in years. And so when I saw that Tone Poet was going to reissue Katanga, I was pretty excited about it. I'm like, oh, I finally get to buy that record. I don't have to go out of my way to buy it for huge money. And boom, Here it is. Interestingly enough, it's not a gatefold. And all the Blue Notes I've gotten so far have been gatefolds. And it wasn't like those Blue Notes were gatefolds initially and Pacific weren't. Neither of them were gatefolds initially. And maybe they just didn't have the photographs to justify doing the gatefold. But even the liner notes come kind of separately on an individual sheet because they wanted to represent the original back. And there's some photographs right there. So why this wasn't a gatefold, I'm a little unsure of, to be honest. It's an interesting thought. So anyway, as I was looking for Katanga and filling up my West Coast jazz library, which is truthfully something I've been doing quite a lot of lately. You know, filling in some really small West Coast labels. I purchased this record probably 5-7 years back. Harold Land, The Fox. And this is originally on Hi-Fi Jazz, a small LA label. It only has a dozen or so really great jazz titles, and the rest of it's kind of easy listening, loungy, cool, Bahia, Hawaii, Taboo. These really funny little titles on Hi-Fi Jazz. But this was a serious jazz title. And the original cover is much different, a weird painting. I'll try to remember to put a little image of it in there for you. But this was reissued by Contemporary, along with the great Elmo Hope record that they also licensed from Hi-Fi Jazz. And this record's outstanding. And one of the things that you notice right away on this record is a guy by the name of Dupree Bolton. And he's a trumpet player unlike many. And he's got some of the fire of Clifford and Freddie Hubbard, the clarity. He's also got some of the emotive tone of a guy like Kenny Dorham, the ferocity of a Lee Morgan. Very little is known about Dupree Bolton. He's an Oklahoma City guy. He moves to Los Angeles with his family, and he runs away from home at 14. He's playing with Jay McShann on the West Coast, who, of Charlie Parker fame, Parker played with McShann back in Kansas City in the 30s. So here's this young Bolton cat, and he makes this record with Harold Land, and this is definitely a record you want to find. But then, about a year later, he gets into the studio and helps out Curtis Amy, the great West Coast tenor player, on this record. And the rarity of this and the cost of it for original pressings is not because of Curtis Amy, as fantastic as he is. It's because of the rarity of Dupree Bolton. It's a scarce thing. There's only 2 records with him on it, and then he just disappears. I think he passed away, if I recall. But it's a short legacy. But when you listen to him on here, he's a ferocious player. They're stating the theme there together. And watch when he comes in here. It's just... Freddie Hubbard. It's bright, crystalline sound and tone. Very clear. Very precise. Very emotive. You can feel a man with something on his chest, and he just wants to try to blow it away. And so it's Dupree Bolton that really kind of defines this Katanga record, and is really kind of what's driven up the elevated the cost of the original copies of Katanga. And so the demand for Katanga is why Tone Poet obviously said, let's put that out. And I'm thankful they did. I was able to get it for the $26 or whatever that Amazon charges for these Tone Poets. Fantastic cover. Ray Crawford and Jack Wilson. Jack Wilson's the great piano player. Rounds out the session. Vic Gaskins on the bass. Doug Sides is on the drums. And Crawford's guitar is very, very tasty on this as well. But there's some real desperation in that. Some ferocity. And it's a pretty late Pacific title here. It's number 70, PJ 70. So it's probably 64, 65. And by this point, it's kind of dominated by the Jazz Crusader sounds. And a lot of the earlier Curtis Amy, the stuff with Paul Bryant, that's just the coolest of the cool, with R&B sounds and just solid grooves and the blues soaked through. but this is a far more aggressive sounding Curtis Amy, with Dupree Bolton spurring along the activities. I've had it for 3 days now. I've listened to it probably 3 times. It's a very enjoyable listen. The tempos are fairly bright. That's more mid-tempo there, bluesy. Nice mid-tempo right there. You can play this at a DJ gig. You know, people just kind of sit back, soak in the vibes and the colors of the day. Fantastic stuff. If I recall, Curtis Amy's also dabbling in the soprano saxophone at this point, something that John Coltrane had very much popularized in 62, 63, 64. So you get a guy like Curtis Amy dabbling, and it's not that tough a transition to go from a tenor to a soprano and alto. You can do that fairly easily. It's not like picking up a whole different horn. So anyway, that's the fantastic Katanga record that I'm proud to finally have in my collection. And if I'm honest about it, it's probably the only Pacific title that's been really hard for me to find. The Nocturne stuff I mentioned, that little small label that's kind of loosely affiliated, those are pretty tough to come by. And some of the 10-inch stuff and some of the Chet Baker stuff, the Baker stuff's kind of rare, but it's more just expensive than it is rare. The Baker stuff, he's probably the second or third most collectible white jazz artist in terms of what their records fetch. Bill Evans is probably the pinnacle of collectible white jazz records. His records go for big money, especially his Riverside titles. And then Art Pepper stuff goes for pretty good money. And then you got to think that he's next, Chet Baker. This stuff can go for pretty good hundreds of dollars. Those 10-inch can go for good money. Stan Getz will do okay, but a guy like Jerry Mulligan, who's royalty, his records go for $10, which is a little disheartening at times, but it's also a reflection of how well those records sold. And the white labels always outsold the black labels 3-1, 4-1, maybe 5-1, maybe 6-1. Again, part of it's a population thing, so the demand and sales are going to be bigger. Part of it's the economics of the white community being better. Part of it's, again, just the fact that these white labels had much broader distribution from coast to coast. But Tone Poet does Katanga, and thank goodness they do. And for all you collectors who are kind of new to jazz, Pacific titles are outstanding. And you don't just got to worry about, oh, I need to find the Chet Bakers. Buy the Chicos, buy the Jerry Mulligans, buy the Bud Shanks, the Russ Freemans, Richard Twardzik. Any of those records, the Curtis Amy's, they're fantastic. Even the Les McCanns, they're going to swing your little bottom off. You know, the Richard Groove Homes. You want a pocket of funk? You'll drop into that syrup and just gestate there. This stuff's serious stuff. And Pacific, in some ways, is more open to things than Contemporary. Contemporary seems to have somewhat of a narrow focus, in spite of the fact that they do some Sonny Rollins and some Ornette Coleman, and they bring in some more interesting stuff as it gets later into the 50s and 60s. Early on, Pacific has a fairly broad scope, and Contemporary seems to be a little bit narrower, but it's just an outstanding catalog of artists, and I really enjoy so many of those Pacific titles. So Pacific's not a label to overlook. When you see them in the store, no matter who they are, if they're $5, $10, $15, grab them and buy Katanga. It's smoking. It's a smoking record. It's one of my favorite Tone Poet releases so far, in part because it's a title I've been looking for a long time, where a lot of these Blue Note titles I've always kind of wanted, but I wasn't like actively seeking them because they weren't part of the official Blue Note catalog. It wasn't like I was trying to fill in that sequence to know the history. This is Tone Poet's kind of making history by issuing a lot of these rare sessions. And again, the Japanese did a lot of them in the 70s and 80s, but the distribution of those here was minimal, and the price can be absorbent for some of those Japanese Blue Notes, can be just so expensive here. For an average non-gatefold, non-deluxe pressing of Sonny Clark Japanese issued only, can go for $100, $200, $300. It's just uncollectible to a collector like myself. So Blue Note and Tone Poet and Pacific all are just such a welcome thing in the record collecting landscape. Super thrilled about it. Loving Katanga. Check it out. And I've seen a lot of it on Facebook. So obviously these Tone Poets are selling fairly well. If you haven't bought it, go do so. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. My name is Dan. Check out my Patreon page if you want to support. And if you want to have some great merchandise, check out my store in the description. There's some great t-shirts and hoodies and tank tops and the like with a lot of different style logos. Appreciate you all. Be safe. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.